Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our class in Halacha. We are learning tonight about Pat Akum, when bread is baked by non-Jews, and what is the reason for that rabbinic decree, what are the limits, what's the scope, what's the range that we have in this area, all right? So we're going to discuss that, and we're going to go all the way from the Mishnah and Talmud all the way to contemporary poskim, all the way to the 21st century to see how it plays out. So I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to begin. But again, please let me know if you have questions as we're moving along. So we're going to have a look here at a Mishnah in Masechet Avodah Zarah, and it says as follows: Elu devarim shel goyim, asurin ve'en isuran isur hana'a. The following things of non-Jews are prohibited. However, that prohibition does not extend to a prohibition of deriving benefit from it. Therefore, you're not allowed to eat these things, but you are allowed to, for example, have shares in them or to sell them or things of that nature, which is not the case for things like meat and milk. I wouldn't be able to get any benefit from them. And these are the examples. Chalav shel bo goy, milk that was milked by a non-Jew, ve'en Yisrael ro'ehu, and there was no Jew to see him doing so. That which we're going to see that, we'll see the Jew seeing that. We'll see that next week. V'hapat, their bread, v'hashemen shalahen, and their oils. Rebi u'beit dino hitiru b'shemen. And the oil prohibition was not very long lasting because Rabbi Yehuda Nasi and his Beit Din, they permitted the oil. We're not going to go too much into that one. Regarding the reasoning for this, Harambam says in source number 2 in his Perush HaMishnayot, in his commentary on the Mishnah, Rov Ele HaDevarim, most of these things, Kegon Hapat, for example, bread and cooked foods and the like. The reason why these things were forbidden was in order to distance ourselves from them, that we should not mingle with them. And why weren't we allowed to mingle with them? So that we are not led through this mingling to a sense of frivolity, and that is prohibited. And that is what they generally termed in Talmudic sources as because of weddings, because due to intermarriage. What is the major concern here? Not that the food is inherently non-kosher, but by interacting with them so much and socializing and having parties and banquets and dinners and the like, we are going to end up into a situation of intermarriage, okay? Literally, as I said before many times, men think through their stomachs. And so therefore, a beautiful smelling dish, freshly baked bread go up the nostrils. Straight thing the man thinks of is not his dinner. What he's thinking of is who he's going to marry. That's certainly what it was down in the Talmud. Is that true today? We could talk about that, but certainly that is the origin of the decree, is because of intermarriage. And the Shach explains here in source number 3 that we're not concerned about their pots, that perhaps their pots were not their spots, but their pots were used for non-kosher food before this. Why? Mishum geole avdei kochavim leka lemechash. We're not concerned about non-kosher flavor absorbed into their pots. Why? Because we learned this last year, Distam Klehem, that their normal vessels, if I don't know if it's been used or not been used, we consider them Einan b'nei yoman, as if they have not been used within the last 24 hours. And as we learned a few months ago, if something has not been used in more than 24 hours, we say that any flavor emitting from that is considered negative. It's, and therefore we're not concerned about it. So here the Shach is explaining we're not concerned about non-kosher food. It's really only an issue of intermarriage, provided that we can establish that the ingredients of the bread are indeed kosher. And this is codified in the Gemara, in Masechet Avodah Zarah, Lamed Aleph, Amud Bet, and explains there, we won't see this inside, that the reason for the decree prohibiting the consumption of bread baked by a Gentile is due to chatnut, intermarriage. And Rashi explains that a person should not frequently have parties with a Gentile, lest his eyes fall upon his daughter. Based on this, the halacha of pat akum applies even when the bread is totally kosher. The Shulchan Aruch codifies this rule in the following halacha, and the Rama adds that once the decree has been set in place, it takes effect everywhere, even in specific cases where there is no concern of intermarriage. Or let's say a person says, what's the concern here? There are no available bachelors in our town. Why are we prohibiting bread? That's not the case. We have a rule. Once the rabbis make a decree, it's the same across the board, no matter what. Or if we said, you know what, our town, we're not concerned that people will be in a state of frivolity, we don't say that. We say the rabbis made a decree in the time of the Mishnah, we stick to it, we're stuck with it, whether we like it or we don't like it, we're in it for the long haul. So let's see how the Shulchan Aruch makes that codification. He says here in Yoreh De'ah, Kuf Yud Bet Seif Aleph, Maran says, Asru hachamim le'echol pat shel amamim of de avodah zara mishum chatnut. Our rabbis in the time of the Mishnah forbade eating the bread of idol worshippers because of the concern of intermarriage. And the Rama, Rav Moshe Isserles adds, "Va'afilu b'makom deleka mishum chatnut." And even if there's a situation where there is no concern of intermarriage, adayin asur, it's still nonetheless prohibited. And then Maran continues, "V'lo asru ela pat shel chameshet minei dagan." It's only the 5 grains, such as wheat, barley, oats, rye, and spelt. Aval pat shel kitniot, but bread made from legumes, v'shel orez v'dochan, or rice or millet, and no bichlal patz dam she'asru. That's not considered bread or regular bread, and therefore you could buy rice bread, you could buy millet bread, you could buy any manner of kitniot bread. It would not have the same issue. It was only the 5 grains. The Pitchei Tshuva says, since this is an issue only of intermarriage, let's say I have a situation of a Jew who is no longer observant. He says there, Ayin be'er hetev, va'ayin be'sefer tiferet leMoshe, siman kuf yud gimel seif tet shekatav. Go and have a look at those 2 sources and have a look. The pat shel mumar shareh, the bread of an apostate or someone who is no longer considers themselves a Jew, that's permitted. Mishum chatnut leka, because there's no concern there of intermarriage. That even though he is a sinner because he's rejecting Judaism, Yisraelhu, he is always a Jew, and there's no such thing as a Jew who can reject his Jewishness. And it's permitted to marry his daughter. Ayin Sham, have a look over there. And so therefore, since we're not concerned with kashrut, it's only an issue of intermarriage, there would be no problem with the mumar, this bread, provided that we can establish that all the ingredients are kosher. Yalkut Yosef explains that when we're talking about that, you saw that Shulchan Aruch said that the original reason for the decree was for intermarriage against idolaters. But Yalkut Yosef, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, the current Sephardic chief rabbi in Israel, says that this, based on his father, Rav Ovadia Yosef, says that this applies to all non-Jews, not just idolaters. And he says here, Pat Bal Habayit Goy, homemade bread. And we're going to get into this whole concept here of homemade versus bread from a bakery. We're going to get into that. But let's hold on for a second. Pat Bal Habayit Goy She'asura Yisrael En Chiluk B'zeh Ben Goy Notzri She'oved Avodah Zarah L'Goy Yishmaeli She'eno Oved Avodah Zarah שהרי כל תעתעה משום חתנות, וזה שייך גם לגבי ישמעאלים שאינם עבודי זרה. So here Yalkut Yosef is explaining that according to Harambam, Maimonides, the Sephardic approach is to consider Christianity idolatry, but to consider Islam to be monotheistic. And so therefore, he says, don't make that distinction in this case, because here the reason why it's prohibited is because of intermarriage. Or it doesn't matter if they're idolaters or they believe in one God. If they're not Jewish, they're not Jewish. Just as a side, Tosafot rules that Christianity is not idolatry. That goes all the way back to a class we did quite a few years ago. Continuing here, and he says, although the rule of Pat Akum appears from the sources so far to be absolute, the Gemara in Avodah Zarah does distinguish between two types of bread. The status of one is much more lenient than the other. We have what's known as pat paltar or pat palter, and this is bread that is baked with the purpose of selling it to the public. And as we will see, the Gemara implies that one may be lenient regarding such bread where there is no bread baked by a Jew available, whereas bread baked by a private person is not supposed to be sold. In this case, bread at home, that would be usually forbidden in almost all cases. Before we go into this whole question of pat paltar versus Pat Babayit, does anyone have any questions? Okay, so far it's straightforward. Let's go into this question. So the Gemara in Avodah Zarah Lamed He Amud Bet says, Rabbi Yosef v'itema Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar. So Rabbi Yosef, and some say it was Rav Shmuel bar Yehuda, said, Lo kach haya ha'maaseh. This wasn't the episode. Ela amru. Rather, this is what happened. Pamachat, one time, halach Rabbi lemakom echad. Rabbi Yehuda Nasi went to a certain place. V'ra'a pat dachuk letalmidim, and he saw that bread was very hard to come by for the students. Amar Rabbi, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said, Ein kan paltar, is there no baker available? And they didn't know what he meant. Kesavrin ha'am lomar paltar goy. Perhaps he thought that he was saying that people thought that he was talking about there's no non-Jewish baker. V'hulo amar ela paltar Yisrael. But that's not what he meant. He was saying, is there no Jewish baker here? And you can see that here, if you look at the notes, the translation here goes into a bit more detail. Is there no baker here who can prepare bread? Upon hearing of this incident, the people thought to say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was referring to a non-Jewish baker, which would indicate that bread baked by a professional baker is permitted even if he is a Gentile. But in reality, Rabbi Yehuda Nasi stated his question only in reference to a Jewish baker. The Gemara cites a qualification of the leniency, that people inferred from the above incident. And he says, Amar Rabbi Chelbo said, Afilu leman da amar paltar goy, even according to the one who thought to say that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi was referring to a non-Jewish baker, lo amran ela deleka paltar Yisrael. We said that the bread is permitted only when there is no paltar Yisrael, no Jewish baker. Aval b'makom de'ika paltar Yisrael lo. But in a place where there is a Jewish baker, the leniency would not apply. So a little bit of a complicated Gemara, so we just have to try and understand a little bit better. Let's have a look at the notes here. It's unclear from the Gemara whether Rabbi Yehuda Nasi allowed pat paltar, bread baked by a non-Jewish baker, when necessary or not. According to Rav Yosef, the people interpreted the comments of Rabbi Yehuda Nasi as permitting pat paltar when pat Yisrael, Jewish bread, is unavailable. But Rav Yosef himself claims that Rabbi Yehuda Nasi did not truly subscribe to this leniency. Nevertheless, Rabbi Chelbo then states that those who do allow pat paltar allow it only when bread baked by a Jew is unavailable, which may imply that he accepts the interpretation of the people. If the distinction between home-baked bread and bread baked by a baker is accepted, it would seem that the reason is that there is more familiarity between the parties, leading to mingling and intermarriage when eating bread at home, as opposed to bread that was baked for sale purposes, where there was no personal connection between the parties and the concern of intermarriage is greatly reduced. So here we go. Why would Rabbi Yehuda Nasi permit it? Quite clearly, when there is no bread available, I'm going to allow, says Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, pat paltar, because the issue of intermarriage is greatly reduced. Whereas pat babayit, bread baked at home, pat balabayit, that's an issue, because there the issue gezerah, the original ruling, the reason behind why the rabbis prohibited it was because people will become too close and to each other, and the issue of intermarriage is still high. Now, all of this is all taking on an assumption that we can ascertain that the ingredients of the bread is kosher. If you look down at footnote number 1 here, at the bottom of the page, we go into great detail that bread today is a very complicated business. And again, I don't want to go into too much into the modern process of bread baking, but there are many, many ingredients involved in the bread, emulsifiers and all these things which are in there, where it's not so straightforward to just look at the ingredients to say if it's kosher or not, to say, you know what, based on the Gemara, if there's no Jewish bakery or there's no kosher bread available, I can just go in and pick any loaf up off the store. It's not so straightforward, but we'll see that as we carry on tonight. The Rambam and the Ran, in fact, do accept the interpretation of the people in Rabbi Chelbo, the lenient position, that when there is no Jewish baker, one is permitted to buy kosher bread from a non-Jewish baker, provided that one is verified that all the ingredients are kosher, since bread is the main staple of most meals. And again, this is another reason why we have to be, well, not why we have to, why we are lenient here, because certainly in those times, less so today, I guess, bread was the central basis of things. So Harambam says here in source number 8, in Hilchot Machalot Asurot, Perek Zayin Halacha Yud Bet, Af al pi she'asru pat goyim, even though the rabbis prohibited non-Jewish bread, yesh mekamot shemekilin badavar, there are times when one can be lenient. Velochin pat hanachtom hagoy, where we can buy from a non-Jewish baker. B'makom she'ein sham nachtom Yisrael, in a place where there are no Jewish bakers, u'besadeh, or in the field, b'bnei shehu shat hadachak, or in the field basically means, I would say, in the country, in the places where it's much harder to find. About pat ba'alei batim, but bread made in a private home. In sham mishem oreh balahakel, there is no one who is lenient in this matter. Shikah hagazera mishum chatnut, because the whole reason of the decree was due to intermarriage. V'im yochal pat ba'alei batim, and if you'll eat home-baked bread, you have all this odet slan, you're obviously going to come and eat with them, and once you start eating with them, it's going to lead to intermarriage. Shulchan Aruch also mentions the same leniency that some practice of permitting pat paltar when pat Yisrael is unavailable. The Ramah then clarifies that the definition of pat paltar depends upon the purpose of the bread rather than who made it. Therefore, a private homeowner who bakes a small amount of bread to sell is considered a paltar, and a baker who bakes bread at home for his family is considered a homeowner. So even if I go to I know that my baker, he works out a Safeway, but as soon as he takes off his whites and he's making bread at home, he's no longer a professional baker. He is a pat bal habayit. So Shulchan Aruch says here in source number 9, Yesh makomot shemekilin badavar. There are places where they're lenient in this matter. V'lochim pat hanachtom hagoy, where they buy from a non-Jewish baker. V'makom she'ein sham nachtom Yisrael, and that's where there are no Jewish bakers present. B'pnei shehi shat hadachak, because this is considered pressing. Aval pat shabale batim, but bread of homeowners. There's no one who's lenient. It's basically quoting exactly the same language of the Rambam, and the Ikar Gezerah, because the main reason of the decree was because of intermarriage. And if you'll eat bread in home people's private homes, you have all this odet slam, you're going to come and eat with them. And here we see that the Ramah adds, it's only considered homemade bread if one is making it for his household. But if he made it to sell, mikrei paltar, then it's considered a bakery, a professional situation. Even if he's not a regular person to sell his bread, as soon as he starts making a sale, and it's an acquisition, then we can be lenient. But conversely, a professional baker who makes for his private use, mikre balabayit, that's considered home style bread. The Shach, that's a commentary on the Shulchan Aruch, the Siftei Kohen, explains that the halacha of pat akum is much more lenient than that of bishul akum, which we learned last week and the week before, where we did not find any distinction in the classical sources concerning a non-Jewish professional cook. Now, why is that? And he explains here, it's because on a play on words on the pasuk in Sefer Devarim, the person does not live on bread alone. He actually says, "Al pat yichye adam," the person does live on bread. V'shayach bei ta'amad Yerushalmi, and therefore we can rely on the reason brought down in the Yerushalmi that it is considered chaye nefesh, literally food that keeps the soul alive. And from this reason, we're lenient with bread, even if you just threw one small wood chip into the fire. And this is not the case when it comes to cooked foods, as we learned last week and the week before. Now, there are some Rishonim who are even more lenient than the Rambam and Shulchan Aruch, and they permit pat akum, even when there is bread available by Jews. And the reason for this is that in their opinion, the whole thing of pat akum was not widespread enough. It didn't take hold. It was too hard for the Jewish people in its entirety to keep, and so therefore they are lenient. So the Tosafot says here, since it states that bread was not permitted through a bedin, that implies that if they wanted to, they could have permitted patakum. And he explains apparently acceptance of the prohibition did not spread. And this, he says here, umikan samchu ata lecho pat shel goyim. And from here, that is what we can rely on now to eat the bread baked by non-Jews. Kevan shalop pashat is through b'kol Yisrael. Since the prohibition had never spread across the entire Jewish people, v'yesh l'smach, and therefore one can rely al divrei Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, on the words of Rabban Shimon ben Gamliel, v'Rabbi Eliezer ben Bar Tzadok, who said, Ein gozrin gezerah al tzibor, ela im kein rov hatzibor yecholin la'amod bo. We only impose a decree upon a community when all of them can abide by it. But if people cannot abide by it, then it never took root and never took hold. And so therefore they're saying, although most of the Jewish community took it on, we can be lenient for those even when a Jewish baker is present. And this is codified by the Rav Moshe Isserles, but not by Maran Shulchan Aruch. And he says here, V'yesh omrim, though those who say, even when Jewish bread or bread baked by a Jew is found, shareh, it's still permitted. And this is brought down by the Beit Yosef according to the Mordechai, and that's Smak, the Seven Mitzvot Katan, and the Hagot Ashrei, and the Yisrael Issalan, and the Sha'arei Dura, and the Isur Heter Baruch. These are all Ashkenazic Rishonim who said that it was permitted in their lands. And again, could well be that the nature of how it was in Ashkenaz in the Middle Ages, it was so hard to find bread that their rabbis were lenient with them. Whereas for Sfaradim, we were not as lenient, perhaps because we could get bread more available to us. The Beit Yosef adds, though, that even those who hold the decree wasn't accepted universally agree that bread of a private homeowner is still prohibited. One should still stay away from Pat Balabayit. And he says here in the Beit Yosef, Katzav od harashba, the Rashba wrote further, Mihu davka min paltar, regarding bread from a baker, I can be lenient, even when Jewish bread is available. The Gemara paltar his kira v'tmon nameh b'Yerushalmi paltar. And here, because it says in the Gemara about a baker, aval mibal habayit, but from a homeowner, afilu em ein lo mayochal, even if he doesn't have what to eat, asur, it's prohibited. Ela im ken mishum sakanat nefesh, unless he's literally, his life's in danger, kamo shenit haneh harbeh, because he's been fasting for such a long time. I mean, again, it doesn't bear thinking about how tough it must have been in the diaspora in the Middle Ages, that they're talking about that. The Shach writes that ideally one should not rely on the Ramah. Rather, one should follow the ruling of Maran, not to buy bread from a non-Jewish baker if there is a Jewish baker in the vicinity. And he says here, Mihu nireh. However, it seems, Diyesh li zaher af kol yemot hashana, that one should be careful during the entire year, shelo likach pat shel goyim min hapaltar, that one does not purchase bread from a non-Jewish baker. Heicha diyesh paltar Yisrael, when there is a Jewish bread, or there are Jewish bakers available. Im lo she'ahapat goy yafeh yoter. However, and here's another leniency, unless the bread of the non-Jewish baker is better in quality. The az shareh, and then it's permitted. Kidol comments if hey, as we'll see later on in if hey. And very interesting, and I remember this coming up in England growing up, they used to talk about certain loaves of bread, which were much nicer, commercial loaves of bread, which were just better than you could get at the local kosher bakery. And they would always throw out, well, sipeh, it says if it's a nicer quality, then I don't have to rely on, I don't have to go and buy from the kosher bakery. I can go and get that nicer one. But we'll see this a little bit. We'll see that in a little bit. So what is the accepted practice nowadays concerning patakum? In Israel, the practice of the Rabbanut is to follow Maran Shulchan Aruch and the Shach. Therefore, all bread baked in Israel is supposed to be Pat Yisrael, bread baked by a Jew. In the diaspora, although some are stringent, it seems that the widely accepted practice in many places is to be lenient based on the Ramah and permit Pat Akum. And so here we might have another situation where Sfaradim have to rely on the Ramah because no other bread is available. But remember, to be considered Pat Yisrael, all we need is a small wood chip in the fire, or as it were, turning on the fire. And that works for Sfaradim as well. Unlike what we learned last week and the week before regarding Bishul Akum, food cooked by non-Jews, where the Jew needs to not only light the fire, but also be involved in the cooking process. With bread, Sfaradim are lenient too. They just need to turn on the fire. And so therefore, when you buy a commercial bread and you look at it, often it will say, there'll be a hechsher on it, but sometimes it will say the words, Pat Yisrael. As Sfaradim, we prefer and want to have Pat Yisrael on there. Whereas for the Ashkenazim, and we're going to see this, there's a much more room to be lenient. And because they followed the Ramah. And that's the position of the OU and many other kashrut agencies, that Pat Paltar, produced by a non-Jewish company, may be certified as kosher only because they've checked all the ingredients and they are kasher, not because the fire has been lit by the oven has been turned on by a Jew. The Shulchan Aruch recommends that even those who are lenient about patakum during the rest of the year should nevertheless attempt to be stringent about it during the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah between Rosh Hashanah and Kippur. As he says here in Source 15, even someone who's not careful about this, during the 10 days of repentance, one should try to buy Pat Yisrael, and if one cannot do that, to make bread themselves, or to be like me, where I'm basically don't eat bread during the week, and on Shabbat, Baruch Hashem, the Rubisa always makes freshly baked chalot. So what used to be a bigger issue for me is no longer an issue. But as I said, there are breads that we can buy in the supermarket that not only are kasher according to the Ramah, but they're also considered Pat Yisrael for Maran Shulchan Aruch. And the Mishnah Berurah says the same thing regarding the 10 days of repentance. One should not buy from a non-Jewish baker during those 10 days. So what is the halacha in cases where even no Pat Paltar is available? Let's say it's just impossible to find. Is there any ever leniency to allow Pat Akum of a private homeowner? Although a number of the sources said no one permits it, the Shulchan Aruch notes that some commentaries do allow eating home-baked bread when no other options are available. And it says as follows in source 17, Yesh mi she'omer, de makom she'ein paltar matsui klau, when there are no bakers at all, not Jews and not non-Jews, mutar afilu shel ba'alei batim. There we do permit, even from a private person, V'chein tzarich lahamtin al pat kasher, v'chein nohagin. And one does not need to wait till we find Jewish bread or bread baked by a Jew. And this is our custom, says the Ramah. And the Vilna Gaon explains the reason why we're lenient, and he explains we learned in the Mishnah regarding damai that we may feed a guest damai. Damai is something where it's doubtful whether trumot and masrot have been taken, that even a Jewish guest may eat the damai due to the pressing need. Thus, the Gra explains that just as it permitted for a traveler who will otherwise go hungry to eat food where we're not sure if the proper trumot and masrot, the proper tithes had been taken, so too it is permitted to consume patakum if totally necessary. There is an important leniency that is relevant even for those who only eat or certify Pat Yisrael baked goods. According to the Gemara in Avodah Zarah, even if a Jew took part in the baking process in a minimal way, as I mentioned before, such as turning on the fire or even throwing in a small piece of wood, the bread is considered Pat Yisrael. So although it seems prima facie on first glance to be hard, it's actually a lot easier to be considered Pat Yisrael just by having the ovens turned on by a Jew. And so, yeah.
Are you talking, when you're talking about baked goods, are we only talking about bread here?
Yes.
Or are we talking, so this is only bread?
So we're talking about anything which is the 5 grains.
Okay, so are we talking about cakes?
No, because cake wouldn't fit into that category, because what we talked about is that bread is the life force of the person. That's why we have this rule to be lenient. With cakes, we would want to be more strict, and then we would go down to that position of what we learned last week, is the Jew also putting the food into the oven, or is he just lighting the oven? If it's just lighting the oven, that's fine for the Ramah and Rav Ovadia Yosef based on that position. But for Maran Shulchan Aruch and those Sephardic Achronim who want to be strict, it wouldn't be considered enough, because they want us to be more involved in the cooking process.
Okay, and my other question is, have we gotten to the practical application of this yet, or are we still just going through all the,
I'm almost at the end. And then we'll see. I think we've got, that's it, one more source, and then I'll summarize.
Okay.
2 sources, then I'll summarize it. So it says here, and this is the whole thing with regarding this bread, that the halacha is Amar Ravina Hilchata Hay Rifta regarding bread alone. The Shagar Akum Va'afa Yisrael, if the non-Jew lit the fire and the Jew was the one who baked it, Inameh Shagar Yisrael Va'afa Akum, or alternatively, the Jew lit the fire and the non-Jew baked it. Inameh Shagar Akum Va'afa Akum Va'ata Yisrael V'chata B'chatui Shafir Dameh. Or alternatively, the non-Jew lit the fire, the non-Jew baked it, and a Jew just came in and added a wood chip, speeding up the fire. That would be enough. And I said this leniency is only regarding bread, and that's the way the Shulchan Aruch codifies it. If the Gentile, hidlik akum et tanur v'fabo Yisrael, the non-Jew lit the oven and the Jew baked in it, or the opposite, the Jew lit it and the Gentile baked it, and even if he just threw in one piece of wood into the fire, the entire bread is permitted, since the matter is only a remembrance that their bread is prohibited. And so therefore, when we go through all of this, we see that to be considered Pat Yisrael is a lot easier to come across than what's considered Bishul Yisrael, at least for Sfaradim. Now, I go all the way to the end of this section. Sorry for scanning fast. I know it sometimes can make us dizzy. We can go to the summary here on page 131, and it says here, what's the reason for the decree? Chatnut, intermarriage. And that was an issue. There's no issue here of ingredients. So provided that we check the ingredients, the issue is because of intermarriage, and this is only for the 5 grains. The Pitkei Tshuva says there's not a problem for a Jew who's no longer observant, provided that you can establish that the ingredients are kosher. And then we talked about pat paltar versus pat bal habayit, where it's home baked versus if it's a baker. And we can be lenient with a baker if there is no Jewish bread available. And that's because bread is a staple that we live on. And the Ramah is lenient even if Pat Yisrael is available. The Shach says we should be strict if possible. However, if the bread is on a higher level than, than the Jewish bread, the kosher bread, or the bread baked by a Jew, then one can be lenient also. But then we said there came to that big leniency in G, where as long as the Jew is even minorly involved, even just putting a wood chip in there, we would be lenient. So coming to the question of today, I'm in my supermarket, I'm walking into Safeway, I'm walking into QFC, or I'm going to Trader Joe's, wherever it might be, Costco, and I'm looking around for kosher bread. What am I looking for? So the first thing I'm looking for is many breads today have a hechsher. That hechsher, just by itself, like an OU or a chaf K, will tell me that it is kosher ingredients. That is what the hechsher is telling me. If I want it to be Pat Yisrael, it needs to say Pat Yisrael on it. The Ashkenazic practice is to be lenient and not require Pat Yisrael, even though kosher bread is available at Affordable Kosher or whatever. You don't need to look for it for Ashkenazim. For Sfaradim, if bread is available, if bread from a Jewish baker is available, we want that Pat Yisrael. So we want to make sure that that's what we're looking for in the supermarket, or we're ordering it from Affordable Kosher or wherever we're getting it from. If that's, except if we're saying that the bread available in the supermarket, even though it's not Pat Yisrael, is of a significantly higher quality, then I could be lenient in that regard. Now, for all that being said, for the Aseret Yemei Teshuvah, it seems everyone, both Maran, the Ramah, all Poskim, say that during the 10 days between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, we should try and be strict, and whether we're baking bread ourselves or making sure that we buy Pat Yisrael. And as I said, more and more Pat Yisrael is becoming available because it's so easy. As you know, to get Pat Yisrael, a lot of the bread products which are given a hechsher by the Space Needle K, by Seattle hechsher of the VADs, those will not only be kosher ingredients, they will also be Pat Yisrael. But each one you can check as you buy the label. There are some times where it's just kosher ingredients, and there are times where it is Pat Yisrael completely. Questions?
Yes, I do.
Go for Sharon.
With the concept of there's a better quality bread, is that a personal preference? Or are you saying it's just like well known that it's a better quality bread?
I think it's a personal preference. I mean, today, you know, you can buy these ones with like 9 or 10 different grains and all these different herbs and flavors. I think those ones, again, provided that it has a hechsher, one could be lenient and say, that's the bread that I want. Now, Sharon, you're asking what's better, the bread which tastes nicer or the bread which is Pat Yisrael? All things being equal, we should go for Pat Yisrael. But sometimes, as we know, it's not always available, and sometimes it is of a lesser quality, and sometimes people just say, you know what, I just want a slice of bread. I'm not marrying anyone. If this isn't part of Chatnut Yisrael, of the Gezerah, and Rabbi Yehuda Nasi said we could be lenient, I want to be lenient. I don't want to be strict on that thing.
Mm-hmm. And what about a certain kind of bread? For instance, I'm just saying like hamburger buns and hot dog buns, which, you know, there's hardly any of those types of breads available. There's just a few. Most of them that I'm aware of don't have the Pas Yisrael on it.
Correct. Those are hard to find Pas Yisrael on them. And those, again, I would say one could be lenient and say, you know what, burger buns are hard to find. I can be lenient in that regard because those are a hard item. But again, if one seriously wants to be strict, tavo alav bracha, it's good to be strict, but one, it's all part of how they're feeling. How about Einstein's bagels? So Einstein's bagels, I believe, again, I need to double check this, but I think that they are, I think the fire is the fire, the ovens are turned on by a Jew, so that would be Pat Yisrael. And people who are careful not to have their dairy products there because they're careful about, because the dairy products are not Chalav Yisrael, but the breads, I believe, are Pat Yisrael. I had someone ask that question on the chat privately.
I'd like to comment one thing also, that it's only the University Village Einstein Brothers that's still kosher now.
Yes, Steve, that's a good point. You're absolutely right. Most of the Einsteins around are not kosher. It's only that one in the U Village. Absolutely. Good hair out there. Thank you. All right. If there's no more questions, that'll be it for tonight. And next week, we'll look at Chalav Yisrael.
Okay, thank you.